Let's bring in James Dorsey, who's a senior fellow at the Singapore Middle East Institute. Welcome to you, James. On the surface of it, when you hear the United States has got Israel to agree to a proposal, it's all down to Hamas. It makes it sound like, okay, if there's any failure now in this possible ceasefire, it's all down to Hamas. But isn't this just the same thing we've already seen before? Israel said, these are our proposals, over to you, Hamas. I mean, Hamas still has to give its own proposals, doesn't it?
It definitely has. I think that what we're seeing is that obviously what the Americans have said yesterday about this now being in the court of Hamas is basically it's for Hamas to spoil an agreement. But having said that, both Israel and Hamas are under pressure to come to an agreement, and both do not want to be seen to be the party that has thwarted it. I think what you're seeing in the negotiations, and that may be the sign of hope, that what we're discussing is a temporary truce, and the hope is clearly on both sides, or certainly on Hamas's side, that can be parlayed, and the Americans would want that to happen, into a permanent ceasefire, and the Israelis see this as postponement of execution. Now, that puts into perspective the issues that your correspondents just spoke about in terms of what the terms are of that of a temporary ceasefire and a prisoner exchange. And those terms are important, not just for the temporary truce and for a prisoner exchange, but they're also building blocks of a potential permanent ceasefire.
In terms of the US role being played here, do you take this as finally, 5 months in, finally a serious effort from the United States government to try and intervene and bring about peace? Or are they just playing the optics game here because it's taken 30,000 dead Palestinians for them to start dropping in food? Why did that take so long? And now it seems like they're making an effort to get a deal, but is it just to avoid a massacre during Ramadan? Is it optics again?
I think they're doing both. If you look very carefully at what the Americans said, they said the Israelis had agreed more or less. With other words, it's not that the Israelis have agreed, period. They've given the Israelis an out here. Now, at the same time, I think that the Americans are serious about wanting to see a reduction, if not an end to the human carnage that we're seeing in Gaza. And that we are seeing in all kinds of ways the Americans putting pressure on the Israelis in terms of the airdrops, in terms of use of the word ceasefire, talking about an end to the war. Those are all, you may say, marginal, but nonetheless, they are shifts in the U.S. position. The question is, at what point do the Americans say enough is enough? This is what we want to happen, and this is what's going to happen if you don't go along with this.
Benjamin Netanyahu, let's just look at his position. Imagine putting yourself in his shoes right now. So you've got the United States pressuring him to agree to a ceasefire, which he clearly doesn't want. He's made it very clear what he wants, which is to get Hamas out, and he's made it clear that he doesn't mind killing civilians to clear a path through Gaza. And at the same time, Netanyahu sees one of his, let's call him a political opponent, Benny Gantz, what seems to be going to America, seemingly being lined up, courted by the United States to replace him, is how a lot of people will see this. Is this putting the Prime Minister of Israel in a bit of a corner, which could be a dangerous place for him to be?
Of course it is. But let's be clear. We're dealing with two parties, Netanyahu and Hamas, who basically have very little regard for civilian life. Having said that, Netanyahu is caught in a catch-22. If he agrees to this ceasefire, he risks his cabinet falling apart. On the other hand, if he does agree to a ceasefire, this could be the beginning of the end, in the sense that if this leads to a permanent ceasefire, then Netanyahu, far more than he is now, will be fighting for his political life. And what I think we see with Benjamin Gantz going to Washington is Gantz is the figure that many in the United States government would like to see succeed Netanyahu, and therefore this is sending a signal both to Gantz as well as to Netanyahu, and what it does is it tightens the screws on Netanyahu.
James, always a pleasure to get your analysis. Very insightful. James Dorsey, Senior Fellow at the Singapore Middle East Institute, is my guest.